Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to review all of the books that I read in September, and September was bonkers for reading. It started out with the Labor Day weekend in which I read a ton, just hours and hours and hours straight, and that kicked off a record-setting month of reading for me. So in September, I read 32 books. Now, before you're just like, who are you and how did this happen? Many of these books are shorter, so let me just say that. Many of them read on audio, and I'm gonna do a more quick review of these books than I normally do, just because there's a lot of them. And some of them I think are just not as memorable, but I'll give kind of a quick snapshot of what these books were. So I would encourage you to settle in, grab a cup of tea, grab some laundry to fold or something like that. As I record this, I'm actually cooking up a big pot of soup. I am totally easing into the fall and really, really enjoying the weather. We have a thunderstorm happening actually right now. As I'm recording this, you might hear that in the background. But it's just been such a great time to ease from September into October, and I'm really excited to share the books I read with you this past month. So in Labor Day weekend, when I kind of kicked off, I also had some books that I had started in August but not finished. And so I had kind of some half-finished books, and I had just this pile. And so I came home the Friday of Labor Day weekend, and I read like all evening. It was wonderful. And so I started with a book called Do Walk. This is by Libby Delana. And this is part of a larger do series of books that have, they all start with the word do, and then they have a word after that. And I loved this book. One of the things the author talks about is what she calls morning walk, and she spells it all one word. And this woman walks like 12 miles every day. She never doesn't walk, like this is a habit for her, a routine. And she talks about the pleasures of walking. And because I love to walk, I love this book. Now, this is a great example of one of the shorter books I read. All of these Do series books are, I would say, under 180-ish to 200 pages. They have images sprinkled throughout. They have things like pull-out quotes included that are really wonderful. Highly recommend this series, and definitely recommend finding them in physical form. I probably have at least 15 to 20 of these books in this series just because I love them so much. Okay, then I picked up a book called I Didn't Do the Thing Today, Letting Go of Productivity Guilt to Embrace the Hidden Value in Daily Life by Madeline Dorr. This is a book that I had picked up from the library after I saw someone talking about it on social media, and I loved the hard copy. I also got the audiobook from my library as well, and that was really wonderful to listen to. I think the author reads the audiobook. This book is exactly what it says it is. It's basically saying, don't feel guilty if you're not getting things done, and like basically live life in a pace that works for you. And I loved it. I definitely added this book to my Amazon wish list to get it in physical copy, just because I really enjoyed reading the physical copy of it. And I would absolutely revisit this book again. Then I picked up a delightful little book called Rain, 4 Walks in English Weather by Melissa Harrison. I don't remember who or where I heard about this book from, but it's delightful. It basically talks about 4 seasons of this woman walking in England, and she describes the weather and the landscape, and it's just a very short like book of essays, and I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. Again, super short, so it was easy to get through that. Then I picked up one of the HBR 10 must read books, and I read a few of these this month. So the first one that I read is called HBR's 10 must reads on career resilience. And this is a book series by Harvard Business Review where they pull together their kind of 10, sometimes 11 or 12 best articles on a particular topic. And I've read a number of these. I've actually found them to be really great, and they are quick reads. Most of these are under 200 pages. And sometimes I'll just kind of pick away at these essays like in between a meeting at work, especially if it's a topic that I feel is like really relevant to what I'm doing at work. Now, this one just drew my attention because it sounded interesting. I mean, this concept of career resilience is just kind of a topic that I think a lot of us are thinking about, especially during this pandemic period. And so I was interested in kind of just learning more and really enjoyed that collection. Next, I picked up a book called Say Yes, Discover the Surprising Life Beyond the Death of a Dream by Scott Erickson. I did not know much about this book. I heard somebody talking about it on social media. This is where I hear about a lot of the books I read. And I was intrigued. And so I decided to pick it up. This is a book that is actually published by a Christian publisher, but the author is very clear that he's not necessarily evangelizing a particular spiritual path. So I think that's important to know just going in. But this is basically a book about how to come back from kind of the edge. I mean, there are parts of this book that get really dark about basically how do you deal with your life when you thought it was going in a particular direction and then it ends up going in a different direction that maybe you hadn't thought of. And how do you kind of pivot or shift into a new direction and decide that you're leaving something behind and kind of turning to something new. I'm always interested in books like that. I love books on change and transition, and I would definitely put this book in that category. Okay, next up, I picked up a book called The Island by Adrienne McKinty. This is kind of a family thriller. It takes place in Australia. It's about a family that goes to this island and it's very isolated, and then they get kind of trapped there and they have to deal with several kind of nefarious characters that are on this island. I listened to this on audio. I will say not a ton of it stood out to me. I mean, I think it's a very quick read. I thought it was great on audio. I wasn't over the moon about it, but I thought it was solid and kind of interesting. And I think I was listening to that book kind of while I did things in the background, like I was doing laundry and things like that. It's a good listen for something like that. Next up, I picked up the latest book in the Temperance Brennan series by Kathy Reichs called Cold, Cold Bones. I really enjoy this series, and this is a book that actually revisited a bunch of older cases by the main character in the book. And this is the 21st book in this series. So I've read 21 books of this character. I just really enjoy this author and how she writes this book. It's about a forensic anthropologist and the various crimes that she investigates and solves both in the United States and also in Quebec. And so the books kind of go back and forth between the two countries. And would definitely recommend this series. And I would encourage you to start from the beginning just because I think it's really fun to go all the way through. Then I picked up the latest in the series by Ellie Griffiths, the Ruth Galloway series called The Locked Room. This is number 14 in the series, latest one. And I also love this series. There are so many series that I read. I started tracking them this year, and I think I read actively 35 different series, or I've started them or I'm partway through, a number of different series. And I love character development. This is one of my favorite things about reading books. And so this is a book about also kind of a person who does archaeology and looks at bones. And she's an academic, which I think is always really fun to have a main character who's an academic. And she has kind of this cast of characters around her, good friends and people on the police force that she works with that really develop over time throughout these books. And this is a book, I'll just give a little trigger warning, that is set during the pandemic, and it is kind of a lockdown story. And one of the characters does undergo COVID pretty significantly. So just putting that out there if you want to avoid those kinds of topics. But I would start from the beginning with this series too. I just think it's really wonderful. Okay, next up I read another Riley Sager, Home Before Dark. I would definitely recommend Riley Sager books for the fall, for October, for Halloween. They're all kind of thriller, ghost story, creepy kind of books. This is one that takes place in basically a haunted house, and also listen to this one on audio. This one didn't necessarily stand out to me ahead or above the other books that I've read of Riley Sager, but definitely was solid and had some nice twists and turns throughout that I enjoyed. Okay, next up I read a book called The Good Lie by A.R. Torre. And this is one of those books that also had some interesting twists to it. It starts out with a character who's a therapist, and the patients that she sees are people who have desires to kill or harm other people, but they haven't necessarily done it. And then something happens in the book and she gets kind of pulled into one of her character's actions or perceived actions of violence, and we kind of have the story go on from there. I always love a book about kind of psychological thrillers, and this was basically a psychological thriller. I listened to the audio on this one as well, and again, thought it was a really solid story. I don't want to give too much away because I feel like there's so many twists and I can't remember how quickly you get into them in the book, but really enjoyed that one too. Okay, then I picked up a romance, Book Lovers by Emily Henry. Emily Henry is a really solid romance writer. This was a wonderful story about two sisters who go on a trip together, and one of them is basically trying to set the other one up by taking her through kind of stereotypical things that would happen in a romance novel. And the main character who goes with her sister on this trip is a book editor and kind of works in the book industry, publishing, and runs into one of her rivals in the small town that she's visiting with her sister, and romance kind of starts to unfurl from there. It was great. I listened to this on audio, would highly recommend. I've read a couple of Emily Henry books and would recommend her just in general. I think she's great. Okay, then I read a book by Benjamin Hardy called Be Your Future Self Now, The Science of Intentional Transformation. This is a book about a concept called prospection, which I am fascinated by. I practice it myself. It's basically thinking about different scenarios of your future self. And I had never heard that word before. I immediately looked it up and was like, what is this? What are we talking about here? But this is basically a book about kind of imagining yourself into your future. And I find that to be really, really interesting, and would highly recommend. I've read a couple of Benjamin Hardy's books now. There's a third one I think I'm going to pick up soon. I just find his ideas really interesting. The writing isn't necessarily super strong, but if the ideas are strong, I don't really care. I always take something away and I find it really interesting. Okay, next up I read a book called The Politics of Promotion, How High Achieving Women Get Ahead and Stay Ahead by Bonnie Marcus. And I think that this book is a great one to read if you are actively trying to work your way up the career ladder. I picked this book up because I coach a lot of high achieving women who are mid-career or later who are actively trying to do this. And I'm not actively trying to do this myself. And so I didn't find the book as applicable to my own situation. It's a lot about how to kind of do self-promotion and talk about your own accomplishments. It talks about how to be politically savvy. And those are things that I can do, but I don't necessarily enjoy. I didn't feel like I took a lot of new things away from this book, but would definitely recommend it to other women who are kind of trying to steadily work their way up in terms of being within an organization and being promoted. Okay, next up I picked up a book called With Love from London by Sarah Geo. I'd never read a book by Sarah Geo, but this is a book about a woman who goes to London because she inherits a bookstore from her mother, and has to kind of come to terms with the relationship that she had with her mother, which was kind of estranged, and she didn't really understand why, and we learn why. We kind of have alternating chapters to the mother's life, back to the daughter's life, past to present day, and this was a lovely book. It was a book about books. There's some things happening in the book that are kind of like a scavenger hunt for the daughter. And I thought it was really fun. I listened to this one on audio as well and really enjoyed it. Next up, I picked up the 7th book in the Wheel of Time series, A Crown of Swords. If you've been following my videos, you know I'm trying to read all of the Wheel of Time books this year. And at this point, I've got to read a couple of books a month in order to get through the entire series. So spoiler alert, I did get to the 2nd book later on in the month. But at this point, I'm not even giving any plot for Wheel of Time, because this far into the series, you are giving away spoilers. There's no way for me to talk about it without giving away some pretty significant things that are happening. I'll just say there's a lot of, what I've said in earlier videos, there's factions that are starting to fight each other, and you're starting to get a deeper understanding of why. The other thing I appreciated about these books is they are starting to get slightly shorter. The books that are kind of in the last few that I've read have been very small print, very long, and these are larger print, slightly shorter. They're all still 600 to 700 pages, so don't get me wrong, it's an investment, but I'm listening to all of them on audio and really enjoying them. Next, I picked up a book called Godland, A Story of Faith, Loss, and Renewal in Middle America by Liz Lenz. I picked up this book in part because it was one of my Alphabet Challenge books from last month. I thought that it would be more of a memoir about kind of this woman's experience of being in Middle America, and her marriage kind of disintegrates because of political differences between herself and her partner. This was really more academic than I thought it would be. It's kind of a study of the church in Middle America, which I wasn't expecting, and was fine. I mean, there was nothing wrong with this book, but it was kind of like not what I thought it was going to be when I went into it. Also a very short book. I think this one was under 200 pages, so it was also a really quick read as well. Then I picked up a book by Abby Jimenez called Life's Too Short. This is another romance. I loved this book. Abby Jimenez is becoming kind of a auto pickup author for me, and I actually read a second book by her later in the month. It was like the last book I read this month. This is a book about a woman who's a YouTuber, and she comes home, and her sister, who has some kind of like substance abuse issues, hands off her daughter to her and just says like, here you go, like here's this infant child. And she starts to raise this infant child, and at one point kind of intersects with her neighbor who's a lawyer, and he kind of enters into her life and starts to kind of help her raise this child. I don't think it's a spoiler to say this is a character, the main character, the female character. She is kind of struggling with some possible like genetic illnesses that she's not sure if she has or doesn't have from her family, but it like runs in her family. And so part of why she does YouTube and travels and all these different kinds of things is because she thinks she might have a shorter life. And hence the title, Life's Too Short. And so we also see her kind of dealing with that throughout the book as well. And I loved it. I just thought it was super fun. One of the things that's kind of interesting is, of the 3 books I've read so far of Abby Jimenez, there's always a pretty significant dog character that plays a role in the story, and in this book that was the case too. So would highly recommend. This is one of those authors that I'm starting to just like auto pick up, when she has a new book come out. Okay, then I picked up another Harvard Business Review 10 Must Reads. This one was on high performance. And I'll also just mention I picked up another one called 10 Must Reads on Lifelong Learning. So I read 3 of these over the course of September. These are great books. Like I said, I dip in and out of them at work sometimes. I find the articles really interesting. They're often a mix of theory and application, and the authors of each of the essays, and it's always an edited collection, so you get a lot of different perspectives. All the authors have varying perspectives from like different industry environments. And the one on lifelong learning, I actually pulled out one of the articles, and I'm using it in a workshop that I'm giving like next week. So one of the reasons I like reading these collections is because I often find something that's highly, highly valuable. There was also an article in one of these, I can't remember which one, where I actually had it scanned and I sent it to my team of directors because I thought they might find it useful. And it was basically on like purpose-filled organizations and like how do you manage your teams to have a purpose-filled job or career. So anyway, I highly recommend these. I think you can always find one that's kind of interesting on a topic that you want to read more about. Then I picked up Glass Houses, which is the latest in the chief, or not the latest, but the latest for me in the Chief Inspector Armand Gamache series. This is number 13 in the series. I believe there's 17 that are currently out, with an 18th coming out maybe this fall or winter, and continue to love this book. Basically, you have a chief of police who is very ethical. He has his own kind of grounded sense of morals and values, and he applies these to various situations where he's trying to kind of build trust with other police officers or with people who are kind of looking up to him. And a lot of the stories of this series take place in a small town called Three Pines. And again, this is one of those series that if I talk about too much about what's happening, I give away spoilers of things that happen earlier in the series. So I'm just gonna say, start from the beginning. It's pretty great. Next up, I read a book called Ultra Learning, Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate Your Career by Scott Young. I thought this book was so fascinating. This is basically a book about people who take on extreme learning challenges. Like, one of the stories in the book is about a man who decides to learn 4 languages in a year by immersing himself in the country of that language for 3 months at a time. And when he goes to that country, he cannot speak any English. And so he just has to like pick up the language naturally, like by talking with people in the country. there were other stories about people who were learning how to be really good public speakers, who were learning how to play chess, who were learning all these different kinds of things. And the author actually taught himself like an entire undergraduate curriculum from MIT, because he was able to download like free exams and things like that from the program, and then basically teach himself through textbooks. So it's a lot of like self-learning and extreme learning, which I'm just completely drawn into. I love those kinds of challenges, and I'm definitely a lifelong learner. So it was really fun to see different kinds of stories. And of course, the author breaks down, I think it's like 9 different steps of how you can do an ultra learning project if you want to set one up for yourself. So highly recommended. Okay, then I picked up Gangster Land by Todd Goldberg, and this is a book that was also in my alphabet challenge. I picked this up in part because Todd Goldberg is someone I followed for a while. He is a co-host of a podcast called Literary Disco, which is a wonderful podcast. It's kind of like an online book group. Like, you get to hear them talk about books, and I found it really fun to listen to this podcast. And I knew that Todd Goldberg was a writer. He also leads a creative writing, like a low residency program, I think at UC Riverside, or he did at one point. And so I've never picked up one of his books. This book was so fun. I wasn't sure what I would think about it, honestly, because I'm not someone who reads a lot of gangster books. But the general premise of this book is you have a man who is kind of connected to the mob or the mafia, and he kills people for them. And he gets himself into a situation where he has to go undercover. And so he goes undercover as a rabbi, and they kind of put him underground as a rabbi. And I don't want to give too much away, because as the story unfolds, it's super fun. There's another book in this series. I'm absolutely going to pick it up. I'm very interested in it. There is the audio is also great. I would highly recommend it. I listened to this one on audio. I had it on an ebook as well. But really, really, really fun. If you're looking for something that's a bit of like a caper, I was super engaged in it. I was surprised at how engaged I was in this particular book. Okay, next up was another alphabet challenge book for me. It's called Good Morning Monster, A Therapist Shares 5 Heroic Stories of Emotional Recovery by Katherine Gildener. I also want to give a trigger warning for this book. The characters, there's 5 different people that she talks about in this book. She's a therapist. She treated each of these people, obviously has taken away identifying details so that she can kind of share their stories. These stories are harrowing. I mean, they're just super intense. These people have undergone extreme amounts of trauma in various ways. She picks kind of pretty diverse stories. So I would just say, know that going in, and know that you could be triggered because of all the kinds of things that these people are dealing with. I read about half of this book, and then I had to put it down and like give myself a break because it was so intense. I did listen to it on audio. I thought the audio was great. I loved how the author really talks about the resiliency of these people that she treated. And also, like, several times throughout the book, she talks about their kind of heroism for going through what they went through and coming out on the other side in a relatively healthy place. And also how hard they worked with her to be kind of healthy. Many of these people were in therapy with this therapist for years to kind of work through the trauma of their childhoods. So I would understand if you were like, nope, not for me. I mean, like, you might hear even that and just be like, no, I don't want to pick this up. But if you're interested in therapy, if you're interested in psychology, if you're interested in healing from trauma, you know, all of those things might be kind of interesting for you if you wanted to pick up this book. Okay, so I also wanted to share, I read a couple short stories over this month, and I'm not counting them as books in my 32 list of books that I read, but I did just want to give them a quick shout out because I thought they were interesting. I read a short story called Signal Moon by Kate Quinn. This is a short story that is basically kind of a time travel-y short story, and it was like, I think free from Amazon Prime or something like that, so I picked it up. Kate Quinn is known for a lot of historical mysteries I've read at least one of her books. I have several others that I want to get to. I don't normally like historical fiction, and I think she does mysteries, and she also just does general historical fiction. But I've really enjoyed her work in particular. The book that I read that I really enjoyed is called The Alice Network. She's got others, Rose Code, and I can't remember all of them. The Huntress, I think, is another one. So anyway, short story by her. Then I picked up a quick short story by Margaret Atwood called My Evil Mother, which is basically about a girl whose mother is kind of a witch. And I just thought it was fun to kind of read that this time of year, and love Margaret Atwood. And each of these was maybe 50 pages, but thought I would just mention them. Okay, next up, there's like 9 left. Next up, I read The Path of Daggers, number 8 in the Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. I won't say much here other than to say, still enjoying the series, feeling, I would say just slightly fatigued with the series, because I think I'm just trying to get through it this year. And I know many people have read these books over several years, because that's how they came out. They came out over a period of several years. It took Robert Jordan a while to write this book, or this series, because it's so long. But also toward the end of the series, like the last 3 books are basically co-authored between Robert Jordan and another person, because Robert Jordan was dying. So anyway, just to say, like, to read all of them back to back like this is probably not how they were intended, but I'm still enjoying it. All right, then I picked up a book called The Wedding Plot, which is number 4 in Mercy and Elvis Mysteries by Paula Munier. This is a great series. I think you'll see my love for series the more you watch these videos. I just love this series. It's Mercy is a retired person who is in the Army, and now she does kind of search and rescue with her dog Elvis. Elvis is also retired from the Army, and in this book, there's like a family wedding, and the wedding keeps getting disrupted because they keep finding bodies. Basically, there's all these crimes that are happening, and so it's kind of funny, but it's also a deeper dive into kind of Mercy's family and some of those relationships, and I just enjoyed it. This is the latest one in that series, and would definitely pick up more in the future. All right, then I read a book called Full Disclosure by Dee Henderson. I've read several Dee Hendersons this year. This is a book that I had read before and had completely forgotten it. Just did not even remember like any details. Of course, as I read it, some things came back to me. There are some plot twists in this book that are bonkers. I think it's super fun. Basically, it's about a very respected female police officer who is kind of a leader, you know, as a police officer. And she's not, well, maybe she is a sheriff in like a small town, but she also in like the entire Midwest, like she gets called in to do like consulting on crimes because she's so good. And then she meets this FBI guy because she basically brings him a case that he's been working on for like a decade. And she brings him like a breaking point in that case where she can kind of help him solve it. And they start to have a relationship. And if you haven't watched previous videos, I've talked about Dee Henderson. She is basically like a Christian romance, like suspense novelist. And so you will see themes, Christian themes in the book. I don't think it's too heavy-handed, but I really enjoy these books. It's basically, you know, what I find kind of interesting about it, I think, is that as somebody who is now in my late 30s, these are books about adults who are trying to have relationships with each other who've like never been married. So it makes me think about like how people at midlife do this. And because I've been married for almost 20 years, it's just a very different experience. And I appreciate watching people come into relationships with each other when they have full lives, full careers, they know themselves really well, and they're not really willing to compromise. And like, that's what you're seeing in these books, which I find really interesting. Okay. Then I picked up another book in the Do series. So again, a shorter one. And this is one called Do Death for a Life Better Lived by Amanda Blaney. And Amanda Blaney is someone who has started what are called, well, I don't think she started this, but she runs one. There's something called a death cafe. And it's basically where people come together and talk about death and try to normalize the concept of death. And what she argues in this book is that a lot of us really think about death as like something very negative, and she doesn't necessarily think that it needs to be negative. She works as a volunteer in a hospice and basically is trying to kind of reshape how people think about death to normalize conversations around it. Like I said, this is one of like 15 books in this series that I've read. I always like the perspectives of what people are bringing because they're just usually different things that I've never thought about before. All right, next up, I read number 4 in the Pendergast series. It's called Still Life with Crows. And this is a book that is co-written by Douglas Preston and Lincoln Childs. And basically, it is kind of like a supernatural thriller where the FBI agent who shows up in these books, whose name is Pendergast, he is always looking at like supernatural phenomenon. And so you know that that's what's happening in these books. And this is a book that takes place in a really small town in Kansas, which I recently lived there, so that was kind of fun. And basically there's like a serial killer, and we're trying to understand what's going on with the serial killer. So he goes in this small town and is kind of like investigating what's happening. A long book. This book was about 600 pages, and I don't know that it had to be 600 pages, but I enjoyed it just the same. I listened to it on audio. Also picked up number 11 in the Anna Pigeon series called Flashback by Nevada Barr. And this is a book that, or this is a series rather, that all of the books take place in a different national park, which is just such a fun premise. And in this particular one, it involves kind of some diving that's happening in this park. And it also goes back and forth between a storyline in the past that involves the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the present day. And so I just enjoy this series. I think it's kind of like a palate cleanser for me to read these books, because even though they're all taking place in kind of different settings, there's a steadiness to this character that it's kind of a known quantity when you read one of these books, like what you're going to get. It's a little bit formulaic, but in a good way. Like I don't mind that. And so it was a good one to read toward the end of the month. Okay, I also picked up a book called My Morning Routine, How Successful People Start Every Day Inspired by Benjamin Spall. I think this is a book, if I remember correctly, that's based on it was like a interview series that this person did with various like well-known people about their morning routines. And I used to get these like over email, and then they changed them into a book form. And so the book is based, it has several different parts to it. Like it talks about people who exercise in the morning, people who meditate in the morning, like there's these different themes. Really quick read, because it's just like these very short interviews of people talking about their morning routines, and enjoyed dipping in and out of it, and it was pretty fast. Okay, a couple other ones that I read to round out this month. The last Alphabet Challenge book that I had to read was The Given Day, which is a number 1 in a series by Dennis Lehane. And this is historical fiction that takes place in the early 1900s in Boston, and is basically about going back and forth between like a character who's Black and a character who's white, and their different experiences living in Boston at this time. There is quite a bit of violence in this book, because it involves the like police union, the beginning of the police union in Boston, and strikes that are happening during that time. So there's a lot of fighting, and there's a lot of violence that happens in this book. I didn't feel like it was super descriptive, but just know that it's a pretty violent book. I would say this book overall is very masculine. Dennis Lehane, I mean, I could see giving this book to like a father or a brother. Like, I don't know that this is a writer that's necessarily writing for women. But I wanted to pick this up because I really like Dennis Lehane. He has a private investigator series that I love, and I've read all the books in that series, and have also really enjoyed some of his standalones like Shutter Island and some other things that he's written. So this one was no different. It was super compelling. It also weaves in some narrative and stories about Babe Ruth, which I thought was kind of interesting as well. And this one was also long. I would say at least 500 pages, but would definitely consider picking up the second one just to kind of see where the narrative goes. Also a story really about families, and how these two male characters, one Black, one white, how they're trying to kind of get back to their families, how they're trying to be connected or disconnected from their families. So a lot of narrative in there about that as well. And then the last book that I read this month was called The Happy Ever After Playlist by Abby Jimenez. So this is the second Abby Jimenez I read this month. This is a book that's part of a collection called The Friend Zone. But what I have seen thus far is they are not in any particular order, because I started reading number 3 in the Friend Zone, and then I read number 2, which was this Happy Ever After Playlist, and then number 1 I think is called The Friend Zone. So it's not, you don't have to read them in order. And normally I'm like a stickler for reading series in order. I think these are more like a grouping of narratives. So I don't even think they have like intermingling characters. This book was really fun. It's basically about a woman who is mourning the death of her fiance from a couple of years ago, and she's out driving, and this dog, like she almost hits this dog, and then the dog jumps in the sunroof of her car. And she's like, what is going on with this dog? And so she's trying to get the dog back to the dog's owner. And the dog's owner happens to be this musician who's like out of the country. And so she agrees to keep this dog until this musician can come back in the country. And then she doesn't want to give the dog up because she's like in love with this dog. And of course, she and the musician begin to have a relationship with each other. I don't think it's giving too much away to say that this is a book that talks about basically fame and celebrity and how to have a relationship in the midst of fame and celebrity. And very quick read on audio. I was able to read this in just a few hours, sped up a little bit, and really, really enjoyed it. I actually read this while I was like doing some food prep this week and like other things around the house. And I would definitely recommend Abby Jimenez. If you like kind of sweet romances, this one was really fun. Okay, so those are all of the 32 books and a couple short stories that I read in the month of September. I really do not anticipate reading this many books again in a month. I honestly think that part of this reading binge was I had a couple of weekends that were like a little bit longer because of holidays or taking a little bit of time off work. And I always read when I have extra time. But also this was the month where things really started to pick up at work. And when I start to be more busy or have a little bit more stress, I read more because it's my way of kind of recovery and resting and having solitude time. I'm super introverted. And so reading is definitely a way for me to get that solitude time. So even though it seems antithetical that when things get busy, you think I'd have less time, I end up usually making more time to have that time to read. And so many good books that were on my plate this month. So that's my debrief for September of 2022. And hang around for the October TBR list. It is definitely themed for Halloween and some spooky books that I have on my list, and I'm excited to share those with you soon. Please feel free to drop in the comments below other books that you read in September that you would recommend for me as well. I always love to hear what you're reading. So until the next video, happy reading.